Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, we so appreciate you listening, you loyal listeners out there, you loyal supporters of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We so appreciate it, and it's all put to good use in spite of what Clay says.
What do you mean what I say?
Well, this stuff about, send us your ranch and buy 100 copies of my book.
I'm not going to waste it. If they send me their ranch, I'm going to, A, retire, B, take up cattle. But I'm serious. Someday someone's going to leave me a ranch, and I think it's only appropriate. But I won't dwell on that. We don't waste any money at the Jefferson Hour. We
don't have any money to waste.
We live close to the bone. Let's put it that way. But you know what? It's amazing that we have a Jefferson Hour. I've been at it for 30 years. That's a long, long, long time to be inhabiting the tights of Mr. Thomas Jefferson, but it has been a supreme pleasure in my life, and the show just keeps growing and evolving and moving in slightly different directions.
But it's the podcast listeners that have really been the supporters of the show so much.
It's so amazing that the podcast is in this growth phase because we have these endless podcast introductions where we often just kind of chat because it's after the program and we're kind of just decompressing and talking about a whole range of things with plenty of digressions. And no matter what we do, that seems to be the case. And yet people still either fast forward through all of that or they like it well enough to contribute to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. So isn't that great?
Well, I guess.
It's fun. I like the podcast introductions because I often want to say things that I don't think are quite appropriate on the Jefferson Hour proper. And I also enjoy just having conversation with you. I haven't seen you now for, I think, 7.5 years. Is that right?
Just about, yeah.
We've been locked down for a while. We've had a couple of drive-bys.
But all things considered, I think we've done pretty well. And we both have had both vaccines.
Well, we're done now. That's good news. And so
what about your daughter? Yeah, I've seen some very svelte-looking pictures of her from Oxford recently on social media. Has she been able to get her vaccinations?
She's at the same college I was at, Hartford, and she's just doing amazing things, but she hasn't had any vaccine yet.
Oh, she hasn't? I'm surprised. I'm sorry to hear that.
Here's what's so interesting, and I don't know how you sort this out in terms of Trump administration, Biden administration, or what, but the United States is actually doing very well now in the distribution of vaccines. There are some difficulties and some spots and so on. I'm not suggesting that it's a flawless regimen, but it's on the whole remarkable.
I think you have to give both presidents credit. I mean, it was the Trump administration that really put a lot of money into getting the vaccine going, but it was Biden and his mastery of government that organized it into the amount of vaccines being put out today. Anyway, that's my take on it.
I agree. Credit where credit is due, but whatever the case is, we're doing well and other nations not so well. So my daughter, they're opening up Oxford now. April 12th was to be the day when things started to open up a little bit. And Trinity term, the third term, they have 3 terms at Oxford, and Trinity is in person. So the students have come back, which is amazing in and of itself. And not all of the tutorials are taking place in person. Some of it is by Zoom and Team and other delivery systems, but things are opening up again. But the vaccine regimen has been slower there, even though the population is under 70 million and it's a tiny island. I'm really proud of the United States. I hope now that we will share both our administrative system, our distribution system, and vaccines with the rest of the world, because there are countries that haven't gotten any access yet and don't have the funds to do this. As the greatest and most wealthy nation on earth, I think we have a moral duty to do everything in our power to put the vaccine into every arm that wants it worldwide, irrespective of their capacity to pay. So I hope that happens. But no, she's doing well. Thanks for asking. She's so cabin fevered that she's just ready to burst out. And I've been reading all these accounts that this is nearly universal, that the world's community, especially the first world's community, is saying enough already. We have got to return to life. And so there's a huge frustration level, and I think that people are going to burst back into the public sphere the minute.
Yeah, I get a little hesitant about that. Anyway, let's move on to the show. This week it's questions and books, and a lot of books mentioned by you. And one question that I didn't bring up during the show was from a listener who asked to remain anonymous for reasons that are in the email, but wanting to know when people can sign up for the 2022 Lewis and Clark trip.
How cool is that? So um, send them a note or send that note to me and I'll write to them. We haven't officially opened it yet, but you can get on our waiting list and we can start to think about that. But also to the Steinbeck trip and to the Cuba trip and to the winter encampments. If you just express to me through the Jefferson Hour your interest, I'll put that in a file. And when things open, we try not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I will gladly let you know. The summer trip, I just was thinking about this morning. Uh, it is such a pure joy. It's the happiest week of my year. Um, we're out there on the wild and scenic Missouri. It's pristine in so many ways.
But it's entirely booked for this year. This listener wants to know about 2022.
There are cancellations, so it never hurts to get on a waiting list because people are still a little edgy about travel and will be, I think, until 2022. But yes, we'll make sure that if someone's interested, they'll be first on our list. So please let us know. And I can't wait to get out there again this year, David. It's a spectacular moment, and it's a time when I feel kind of marvelously alive for those 10 days. And invariably out there around the campfire, people say, does this Swenson exist? Is he real?
You'll never know. I just texted you this email about the inquiry on 2022 so you can respond.
So, I mean, you haven't answered my question. Does this Swenson exist?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to that episode with Ellison, American Conspiracies, and how Americans love conspiracies.
I'm only telling you what I hear. They have here are their questions.
Yeah, that's how it starts.
Their questions are: does David Swenson exist? That's number one.
Personally, I'm just fine with the idea that I don't.
Then, secondly, they say, why doesn't he ever come on these trips? And I think that's a harder question.
The truth is my summers are the busiest time of the year for me, owing to a couple of projects that are annual events. And I mean, I just look at my calendar and go, yeah, but when am I going to garden? I am so swamped in the summer, I can't even think about it.
Their third question is, assuming he exists, what's he really like? Yeah, I'm just saying that these are the questions, and you think I'm making it up, but I'm not. I get out there, and on night one, they say, well, why doesn't David come?
Well, I'm flattered. I really am, and honored to be part of the Jefferson Hour. I regard it as one of the more important things I do, but you're not going to see me out on the Lewis and Clark Trail. I'm not going up that march.
The Wendover Death March would be good for you, and you would be cheerful on it. If you died, we'd bury you on site.
Oh, okay. Well, there's that then.
Yeah, and this would save some funeral expenses, and But anyway, no one has ever died on the trip. Although,
how do we say that? What is it? That phrase you use? You're breaking up. We gotta go.
Talk about wasting airspace. We have now spent about 20 minutes preparing for the show. This is a program about books, about listener questions. It's out of character. But I want to say as we close, watch Ken Burns' 6-hour documentary on pbs.org, streaming anytime you want on Ernest Hemingway. It's a masterpiece.
And go to jeffersonhour.com to find out more about Clay's cultural tours, his books, and the show, and you can also support it there. So thanks very much.
And do send the ranch, but let's listen to the program.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson or the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And this week, the conversation will be with or Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to speak with you, sir.
Well, I'm still recovering from my test of the citizenship test that you put to me on a previous program. And
oh, now, you did very well.
We had not rehearsed that in any way, and I lived in fear of being expelled from my country on the other side of the wall. I mean, imagine suddenly finding yourself on the other side of the wall at El Paso or San Diego in the United States. And so I'm lucky.
Or North Dakota.
I survived by this. I was up at the International Peace Garden last week. It's wonderful. It's this sort of no man's land, this demilitarized zone between the United States and the provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and it's a marvelous place. I've always loved it. And yet now in the post 9/11 world, and particularly during the pandemic, it's not easy to get in and out. So you get into the Peace Garden without actually uh, going through Canadian border control. But when you come back out of it to get back into North Dakota, you have to go through U.S. Border Patrol. And I've had several sort of unpleasant experiences doing this. And so that kind of violates the very principle of a peace garden. But this time I was very fortunate, David, because I went through and I handed my passport to the grumpy looking person at U.S. Border Control, and he disappeared. And then this other guy came to the window and said, "Hey, you're Thomas Jefferson." And I said, "You bet I am." And I said, how long, what is your name? How long have you been listening? And, thank you so much. And so we built this rapport. And then when the more grumpy guy came back, he said, "Oh, he's all right. He's fine. Send him through." And so that's the only time in my life that the Jefferson Hour has actually been an advantage.
Really?
No, but
Really?
it was an advantage that day. And so yes, I think that the citizenship test, which really comes out of our friend Joseph Ellis, believing that in his sort of cynical or disillusioned way that every high school student in America should have to pass our own naturalization test. I think that is a good idea. I think some things like that do actually exist in some states, but I took it because I thought if we're going to say that about young people, we should say that about ourselves, and I should have to pass that test either in or out of character. And then you sort of sprang it on me, and I'm glad, because otherwise I would have lost a lot of sleep before appearing in that examination room.
Well, this week I wanted to speak with you because we've fallen behind, as usual, in responding to listener mail and questions sent in, both for you and Jefferson. And really, that's the lifeblood of the show, is the support and the mail we get from our many listeners, and we so appreciate it. And I will say again, I read every piece of mail that comes in.
Thanks to everyone who takes the time to listen to the program, either on National Public Radio networks or by way of podcast. And even more thanks for those who contribute to the show in one way or another. And in this case, I mean by writing us letters. Those letters are vital to our feedback loop. It gives us a chance to sort of measure how things are going out there and what people are thinking and what they agree with, what they don't agree with, their suggestions, and their open and curious questions about the world of Thomas Jefferson. It's a very satisfying part of what we get to do, David.
It is, and we also get some very insightful questions and comments, and hopefully I'm going to be able to present some of those to you this week. I shall start with one from Richard Prestholt. He writes, on April 8th, President Biden stated that, quote, no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. Since President Jefferson was so insistent that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution, what would Jefferson say in response to President Biden's statement?
President Biden is right, I think. That is, that nothing is an absolute. So we say that we shall have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, etc. But there are exceptions to unlimited freedom of expression. We all have heard about the famous one, shouting fire in a crowded theater. There are some types of expression that are too far beyond the norms or the acceptable behavior in our culture, and therefore we find a way to discourage and sometimes outlaw such expression. All of the rights of humanity are contingent. My rights are absolute up till my boundary, and if they start to encroach on your rights, David, then they have to be negotiated to a certain extent. We're not absolute sovereigns. Aristotle said that man is a social animal. We're a political animal. We take our purpose and our meaning by living in a polis, by living in a society. And in a society, we have to make reasonable accommodations of each other. In a friendship or a marriage, these things are done. One person doesn't get to choose the restaurant every time. One person doesn't get to choose the film every time. There are ways in which you have to accommodate differences in any meaningful relationship, whether it's a personal relationship or a broad social structure. And so we need to understand that. That's one. We also need to understand that rights have a corollary in responsibilities, that rights are not an unlimited grant of liberty from a social structure, that there is a give and take in all of this. And I think that tends to get forgotten in America, where it's rights, rights, rights on steroids. And we forget that there are also concomitant social responsibilities, et cetera. So I think, what President Biden was talking about specifically in this case is the Second Amendment. But I will say this much on behalf of the Second Amendment. It is the Second Amendment. It's not a routine law passed in 1837 or 1942. The Founding Fathers said that the right of the people to keep and bear arms is an essential human right. Now, just because it's second doesn't mean that it's the second most important. These are more or less arbitrarily numbered, but it is in the Bill of Rights, and that means it has very, very strong rootedness in American constitutional culture. And that means when we come close to wanting to regulate armaments, we have to be exceedingly careful, because we are butting up against something that is that central to the Founding Fathers' vision of the United States. We may be misconstruing their intent, but that doesn't ultimately matter as much as the fact that it's there. And so we need to be respectful and cautious and circumspect, and to have a deep hesitation before we march into that arena. And I think probably that's a mistake that the Founding Fathers imposed upon us, entailed upon us, but it's a mistake that's there. And people who want to say, well, that was then and this is now, or why should we honor this if it's causing mayhem in the country? I think that is a dangerous line of argument, David, because I think that the Bill of Rights is incredibly important. And if people started to chip away at freedom of expression or freedom of religion or freedom of assembly, saying, well, that was then and this is now, I would be one of the first people in the streets to insist upon a due respect for something that important, that it became one of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
You are saying very important, but not absolute. This question from Richard Pressholt made me think of Jefferson during the citizenship test last week, where we asked him about, the question was something to the effect of how many amendments were there, and he answered by saying, only 27, certainly not enough.
I certainly feel that. I had the good fortune to teach these online public humanities courses on the Constitution. We had lots of students. I'm going to do it again. It was a very rich experience, and it turns out we're living at a time when the Constitution is suddenly very important again, centrally important. And it's important that we know what the Founding Fathers were doing, what they intended, what they produced, what they failed to resolve, and particularly in that case, slavery. But it's really important that we have a deeper understanding of the United States Constitution, which we have tended to be complacent about, because we frankly didn't think that it would become as fragile as it appeared to be in the last few years, or as contested. And so when I did the course, I did a lot of reading, and there's a wonderful literature on the Constitution. There are hundreds of books, but 5 or 6 of them are really extremely accessible and useful to anyone who's interested in this subject. And so, of course, I looked at the Bill of Rights. We did a whole session, a weekend, on the constitutional amendments, of which there have been 27. And the last of them, David, was 1992, and it was about essentially a frivolous subject about congressional pay. So there really haven't been that many adjustments to the Constitution, and we need them. We need a significant number of adjustments. We need to decide about representation in the Senate. We need to decide whether we want to prohibit an endless national debt. We have to clean up the war powers authority and determine, in a 21st century context, how to make sure that war can only be declared by representatives of the people in the House of Representatives. There are 8 or 10 or 15 really vulnerable areas. We need to clarify what impeachment means. We need to clarify what an emolument is. We need to clarify the pardon clause of the Constitution. In a sense, Donald Trump did us all a favor by calling attention to these fragilities and these ambiguities in the Constitution. And now it's in our interest to try to repair the guardrails and give more clarity to any person who stands for the presidency or any other high office hereafter. And so when I looked at this and saw that after the Bill of Rights, there are really only 17 amendments, and one is prohibition and another is a repeal of prohibition, so that takes it down to 15. Then there are a couple that are merely procedural, of no great importance. The number of really substantive amendments in 234 years has been about 11 after the Bill of Rights, and that just doesn't seem enough. Jefferson believed that you either have to amend the Constitution quite frequently or you need to tear it up every 19 or so years, or both. And so it's 29 years, David, since the last amendment to the United States Constitution. I don't think a dynamic society like ours, where last year's iPhone is regarded as a medieval typewriter, I don't think that we can live with so few adjustments to our basic code of laws.
Yeah, you've talked often about Jefferson's desire to tear the Constitution up and start again every generation, and the imagined eye roll that he got from Madison after that.
Poor Madison.
Right. We need to take just a short break, and when we return, we shall answer more questions from our listeners. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson and/or Mr. Clay Jenkinson. This week, we're speaking with Mr. Clay Jenkinson, who is answering listener questions. Welcome back, sir.
I'm glad to be here. I miss being Jefferson, and I don't get to travel as Thomas Jefferson much these days. I've been on lockdown. I'm eager to get back into my tights and my buckled shoes and my breeches and my greatcoat and my wig and get back on the road because I love performing as Thomas Jefferson. It's been one of the central activities of my entire life. I've spent more time with Mr. Jefferson than with any other human being. I've had a longer a relationship with Jefferson than with any other human being. He's shaped my life in some extraordinary ways. I can dream Jefferson. I can channel Jefferson. It's a strange phenomenon, and I try to think of my life that I attached myself to this historical figure long, long, long ago. And although there have been moments of weariness and frustration with Jefferson, he continues to be so compelling to me. And I so believe that he was right, that we need a Jeffersonian society, and that we need more participation by the people. We need a better educated people. We need to move towards greater civility. We need to restore our faith in our institutions. We need to believe in majority rule. All of us need to be out in nature more, putting our hands in the soil. There are so many things that I find utterly compelling and convincing about Thomas Jefferson. I'm glad that I live in a country that had a Jefferson. I wish he had been untouched by the problem of slavery and untouched by the need of his generation to overwhelm the native peoples of the American West. There are many things that I would fix for my great friend Jefferson if I could do it, but we are what we are, and all of us are complicit in many different ways with our behavior, with our values, with things we don't even recognize in ourselves. And so it's been an honor and a deep, deep satisfaction to portray Jefferson to the world that's willing to listen to us. And so I'm always glad to be in character, but sometimes there are things we get questions that are really out of character questions, and sometimes there are things we can only get at by not letting Jefferson be the filter.
You mentioned some of Jefferson's loves, and one you didn't mention was books. And I have a couple of questions relating to books, sir, if I might present them to you.
Yes, books. I was asked by some friends the other day what my organizing principle is for my library, and I said, it is simple. It's called stack of books, piles of books. I've got a real problem. I have more books than house, and you've been to my house. It's a library, and I still have more books than house. So I'm trying to downsize. Every week I'm packing up a box of books that I know that I will never read again. That's a very dicey and dangerous thing to try to work out, but I'm doing it. And I'm going to give away enough books in the next year to local libraries and so on. These aren't very valuable books, but they were once valuable to me. But I'm going to give away enough so that I could put every book that I have on a shelf somewhere. And that's probably about 1,000 books.
We deviate from our purpose here, sir, so let me get back to the book questions, if I might.
Indeed, sir.
The first comes from Richard Uglow, who writes, in a recent episode, Clay mentioned a book about the Supreme Court that discusses the various eras of the court and one-term presidents. I am unable to find that book name and author and would appreciate that information. Can you recall, sir?
Yes, that book is called The Cycles of Constitutional Time, and it's by a man named Jack Balkin, Balkin. The Cycles of Constitutional Time by Jack Balkin. It's a fascinating book. I actually interviewed him for Governing magazine, governing.com, so people can go to look at it there. But what he argues, David, is that we work through these cycles. So, and here they are in a nutshell. The Founding Fathers until the election of Jefferson, that was 1800. The Jeffersonians from 1800 to 1828. The Jacksonians from 1828 to 1860, then the Civil War, and after it, a long period of Republican ascendancy. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. And then the Republican ascendancy ended in 1932 with the election of FDR. The New Deal went all the way through the Carter administration, ending in 1980. Then the Reagan Revolution came, and we're still in it, and we've maybe just gone out the other side. What he says, among other things, is that the last president in one of these series tends to be a one-term president. And so that was true of Jimmy Carter. That is true of Donald Trump. But he believes that we are now possibly entering a second progressive era. But the reason I love this book is that I like to view these things at 38,000 feet. I've spent the last 5 years looking at our situation from the ground level, and I've read probably 50 books on the subject of where we are as a nation, why we're so polarized, what does Trumpism mean, why are the parties at each other's throats in the way they are, what happened to civility and majority rule, and so on. And so I've read everything I can get my hands on. I've mentioned many times how much I like Tim Alberta's book, American Carnage, but this book, The Cycles of Constitutional Time by Jack Balkin, really pulls us out and lets us see how these patterns appear to develop and evolve in the course of American political history. And so I very highly recommend it, and I had a wonderful conversation with Jack Balkin for this interview that will appear in Governing magazine.
And then we go to Mary Thronveit, who writes, many books were suggested for reading for a variety of topics today. Can I find a list of these and other books that you reference on your program? Thank you. Often books that are mentioned are included in the show notes, but maybe we should look into that.
I think so. I had a conversation with some friends a couple of days ago, and they said that I'm constantly recommending books and that they have actually taken some joy from that because they don't choose all of them, but they frequently consider borrowing or buying the book that I mentioned, and that this has been something that they regard as important and useful. And so I thought, well, maybe we should have a page on the Jefferson Hour site that sort of Clay's recommendations or Clay's Goodreads, the things that I'm working on, or yours for that matter too, David, and just saying, here's a book that you might want to take a look at. So you've been suggesting this Atkinson series on the Revolutionary War. I haven't yet read it, so that would be an interesting thing to post. And so I would like our webmaster to create a page of sort of Jefferson Hour picks, and then we can put the title in and maybe tie it to the show where we talked about it, and then a brief statement, a description of why we think it's a useful book.
We have limited resources, but we should certainly devote some of those resources to that effort. And having said that, I'd be missing an opportunity not to say, if you want to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. There's a couple of different ways to support the show. and we so appreciate it and we need it and we put it to good use.
Indeed, we do. But that's an interesting question. And I like the idea of having this, because I was asked by this same group, how many books have I read since the pandemic started? And I was trying to make a list of it, or kind of a mental list of it. And it's a lot because I have to read for so many different projects and so many different initiatives. And now I'm doing these interviews on governing. And so I have to read the book of the people that I'm interviewing. And I'm doing some exhibits. And I've, of course, been writing a book. And so it's an enormous amount of reading. I'm very, very fortunate. I get to read for a living. I get paid to read, but I've read more probably during the 16 months of the pandemic than I've read in any year of the last 15. And so it's been marvelous in that way, but I forget some of the things that I've read until they kind of pop back into my mind, and I would be better off if I had a complete list and some initial reactions to those books.
I'm interested to hear your answer to this next question. It comes from John Slavich, and it's about the National Road, which, as you know, President Jefferson signed a bill into law that created the National Road, and he's kind of interested to know what Jefferson's view towards federally funded infrastructure projects were generally, and the National Road in particular.
That's a great question. This is Jefferson's infrastructure bill. That's how we talk about these things today. Jefferson was very weird about this. He was such a strict constructionist on the one hand, in other words, a very narrow reading of the Constitution of the United States and what it enables and empowers. And he was so obsessed with fighting the national debt, Hamilton's gift to America, on the other hand, that he devoted most of the revenues of his 8 years as president to debt retirement. About 70% of all federal revenues during that period were spent on debt retirement. Think of that. And so these were the twin poles of Jefferson's administration: debt retirement, which required enormous fiscal discipline and sacrifice, and then his strict construction. So he didn't want to do anything that wasn't authorized by the Constitution in his narrow reading of what was authorized by the Constitution. And that's one reason, for example, as you and I both know, David, that the artifacts of the Lewis and Clark expedition disappeared because Jefferson refused to authorize a national museum or any other warehouse to put them in. And so some of this hamstrung Jefferson. And when he thought about infrastructure, he always said, yes, but there must be enabling constitutional amendments, because infrastructure was not listed in Article 1 of the Constitution by the Founding Fathers as one of the things that a United States government could do.
But Congress appropriated the funds for this. Wasn't that enough for Jefferson?
Yes, Congress appropriated this, and Jefferson accepted it. Why? Because he thought that you should only veto legislation if you were certain that it was constitutionally suspect. In other words, you should never veto legislation on a question of policy. You should defer to Congress. Only if you feel that something is a violation of the Constitution should you ever veto a bill. And so he reluctantly did not veto this bill, but he did refuse other infrastructural arguments, including those by James Madison, his closest friend, and said, until we pay off the national debt and until we have proper enabling legislation, we must not be doing these things. Well, in this case, Jefferson was out of touch with the needs of the country. We were going to read the Constitution more broadly than he thought. He himself at times read the Constitution more broadly than his principle suggested. And so we got the National Road, and we're the beginnings of all this. But if Jefferson had been Hamilton, we would have probably given a great deal more money to the infrastructure of the United States between 1801 and 1809, and we probably, frankly, would have benefited greatly from that, because the biggest problem in America at that time was isolation, detachment, that things were so far from each other, and there was no adequate means, there were no adequate roads, there weren't inns, there weren't hotels, there weren't pubs, there was the post office system even was strained, that it was very difficult to get around and to get information around in this vast new country. And so this was a real problem of knitting the country together and making our system efficient. And Jefferson's strict construction, his reluctance to spend money before we had it in hand, was probably in the long run, a developmental mistake. It makes Jefferson seem pure, which he was in many regards, but it probably wasn't the best thing for the emerging Republic of the United States. But Congress did it, and the road was built and in Pennsylvania, and it became the first of the federal highways.
It was really expected to be a boon to business. At that time, there were no roads. There were paths and old trails, and farmers, traders, they had no way to move their goods to market. So there was this potential boost to the country's economy. I think we should point out, too, that Congress appropriated a huge sum of $30,000 to build this road.
Well, there went the budget. There went the national debt. But let me say something to you about this, David, because we're talking about books. The book that I'm most enamored with right now is Lakota America by Pekka Hamalainen, a Finnish professor of history, American history at Oxford University. His book, Lakota America, I cannot recommend more enthusiastically or highly. And in it, he says this incredibly interesting thing. He says that the railroads that were built, the transcontinental railroads of the 1860s and 70s and 80s, we all know that they were part of the conquest of the native peoples of the American West. We've all grown up with that understanding that they were able to transport materiel and troops and ordnance very quickly into faraway places that were otherwise inaccessible. But he goes on into a much more interesting insight. He says, look, every 10 miles there had to be water. There had to be a stopping point, a depot of some sort. And the minute you create these little pearls where you have to stop the train because it's steam engine, then you're going to have a barracks, and you're going to have a couple of cafes, and you're going to have some sort of troops stationed there or some sort of system of order, and then you're going to get a Masonic lodge and a church, and then you're going to get a school, and then you're going to get a town. And so that he said, when Native Americans watched this, when the Lakota watched this, they realized you're not just putting a railroad through our territory, you're putting a series of settlements every 10 miles, and they are inevitably going to grow and use up resources like kill off the buffalo, the antelope, and the deer. And this is going to give the presumption of white settlement just because you have to service that railroad, and it's going to hasten our loss of our sovereign territory. David, I had never thought that. I had never recognized that in decades of reading about the wars of the American West.
Again, this question comes from John Slavich, who, by the way, grew up in Richmond, Indiana, and says that the National Road Project, didn't reach Indiana until 1827, the year after Jefferson's death. So to summarize, Jefferson's view towards federally funded infrastructure was what?
You can't spend money that you haven't in your pocket. You can't borrow against the future to fund even desirable things in the present. And until we retire the national debt entirely or close, then we should not be funding any of these things. And besides, you probably need enabling constitutional amendments to authorize them. So he winds up being pretty negative about infrastructure.
But even Albert Gallatin, we talked about him a lot in a previous show, he was a real advocate for this. And he was Secretary of the Treasury. So he must have seen that building this road would lead to some kind of an economic boom.
Of course. I mean, it's the same story with the interstate highway system of Dwight Eisenhower. Think of the economic development that the interstate highway system has enabled and magnified, not just in the communities that have benefited along those interstate highways, but just the capacity to transport goods and services very quickly and efficiently around this country. Infrastructure bills are always a good idea. I hope that the Congress of the United States will pass the one or one like the one that's being proposed. We need it. Our infrastructure is deteriorating, and infrastructure is an incredibly important economic investment into the future. And if you don't need to be a very serious student of the history of transportation to see this. Some of the great stories in the history of economic development have been transportation stories. And I remember reading, for example, about a bridge near Wheeling, West Virginia. And when they wanted to build it across the Ohio, there was all this concern and skepticism, and why should we fund this, and so on. And The community that didn't fund it wound up being left behind, and the community that sacrificed to fund it wound up prospering in every possible way because of that key piece of infrastructure. And the same thing is true of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal won out over the Potomac Canal, completed in 1825. It led to the Empire State. It made New York the gateway into the American West. So infrastructure is so important, and we are desperately in need of a renewed infrastructure initiative in this country, and I hope that we can get over our partisanship and just get it done.
I agree. If we don't do something like this, it's kind of like handing our future to our adversaries. With that, sir, we need to take a short break, but we will return. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back, everyone, to the special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character, out of tights this week, and sitting across from me, virtually at least, is Mr. David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David, just one more thing about infrastructure, and I heard Thomas Friedman on one of the major talk shows about a month ago, and he said, here's the problem. While we languish in our national paralysis here, China has a new bullet train that can in 5 hours go farther than a train in this country goes in 25 or 30 hours. He said, they're going to leave us, the world's going to leave us behind. The world is doing incredibly smart, high-tech things, and we are languishing in our political swamp, our miasma of mutual recrimination and sheer ugly partisanship. He said, this is no way for the greatest, most powerful, wealthiest nation on earth to behave. And meanwhile, other nations, including some that could be regarded as our adversaries, are moving ahead with breathtaking speed.
I'm sitting here at my computer recording my end of the show and monitoring emails that come into the Jefferson Hour. And we just got another one from Melvin Palmer asking about that book about historical political eras that end with a one-term president. So maybe you better give that title and author one more time.
Absolutely. Jack Balkin, The Cycles of Constitutional Time. And he turned out to be really fun to interview, too. I really recommend this book. You know, I love to see these overarching, I like Sapiens and Homo Deus by Yuval Harari, or Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. These books that kind of pull away into a hot air balloon and go up high and look at these broad dynamics and movements in the history of civilization, in this case, the history of constitutional government in the United States. And I had never thought about this before, that, you know, John Quincy Adams was a one-term president, and James Buchanan was a one-term president, and Herbert Hoover was a one-term president, and Jimmy Carter was a one-term president. And now Donald Trump has been a one-term president, and they all come at the end of one of these big cycles when the dominant approach to our political life has run its course. Where, remember, when Ronald Reagan came to power, he said the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And even Bill Clinton then said famously that the era of big government is over. And so we've been in this mode, this suspicion of government, this deconstruction since 1980. And now we came up on this pandemic and we realized, oh, in certain situations, we really need a strong, efficient, and masterful national government, and we didn't get it. So now there's a kind of a movement towards a more generous attitude towards the national government. Whether this plays itself out in the way that Jack Balkin thinks it might remains to be seen. It'd be insane to predict too much. But the pattern certainly has worked. And when I think of Jimmy Carter, I've just read Reaganland, another book I recommend by Rick Perlstein, who's a friend of mine. He's written 4 books on the conservative movement in the United States, beginning with Barry Goldwater, most famously his book Nixonland. But this one is called Reaganland. It's immense, but it's really very valuable. And he talks about the administration of Jimmy Carter, who's a one-term president at the end of the New Deal. And when he loses in 1980, guess who wins? Ronald Reagan, who's saying big government is the problem, not the answer. And then we moved in that direction for this whole period, and look where it has brought us. And so now Balkin believes we may be in a mood to move into a kind of more progressive era where we ask the central government of the United States carefully to do some important things on our behalf.
Another question, this one from Neil Abellis. He says, hello, I'm interested in attending the North Dakota online course. Can you tell me if the Zoom discussions will be recorded so that I can watch them at any time? This will be my first experience with an online course. I'm 80 years old and thoroughly enjoy your show. He listens on radio station KTXK.
Send me his email and I'll write to him directly. But yes, people can still sign up. It starts on May 8th through June 4th, 4 Saturdays. And you need to have Zoom capacity, but we record them all. So if somebody has to miss for some reason, then they can watch them later on a private YouTube channel. And yes, of course, this one will be, I'm really looking forward to it, David, because it's about the Great Plains, which, I love, as you do. And the books are fantastic. Anne Marie Lowe's Dust Bowl Diary, which was written in North Dakota, and then the Rachel Kaloff story, which is this really crazy and interesting homestead story about a Jewish homesteader in North Dakota, and then two sort of national classics, Willa Cather's masterpiece, My Antonia, which is one of my very, very favorite books, and Kent Heroff, the late Colorado writer, a book called Plain Song about a young woman in eastern Colorado. And any one of these books, although they're not all set in North Dakota, could have been written here because the Great Plains have a kind of a sameness in many fundamentals. And then my own book, The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota. So those are the books for it, and it will start on May 8th, and people can go to jeffersonhour.com to find out more. I'm glad that he asked, but I will send a note to him suggesting ways that he can sign up because this program may not be broadcast soon enough for him.
This one comes from Elizabeth Hennis Sund, and it's a question about the book The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan, a book that I know both of us have read.
I like Timothy Egan's work a great deal. The Big Burn is one of his books. The Worst Hard Time is one of his books. Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher is one I'm reading now for an exhibit I'm creating about Edward S. Curtis and Theodore Roosevelt. He's a terrific New York Times columnist and journalist. He's coming as the keynote speaker, by the way, to the 16th annual Theodore Roosevelt Public Humanities Symposium in Jenkinson, North Dakota, at the end of September. I invited him, and to my great surprise, he's coming.
That's great.
Fantastic. But the Worst Hard Time is about the Dust Bowl, and I read it carefully. There are 4 or 5 excellent books on the Dust Bowl era, including one by historian Donald Worcester. But Egan's book is extremely readable. Here's the only thing I would say about it. He's writing about the Central Plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. In fact, the Dust Bowl was harder on North Dakota than any other state. We think of the great John Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath, people from Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas. We called them Okies. But the more North Dakotans left the state in the 1930s by percentage of total population than any other state. And of course, they didn't come back. North Dakota was devastated. At one time, 175,000 North Dakotans, about 1 in 6, were on direct federal assistance, not grant programs, not the CCC or the WPA, direct federal assistance. It was a dark, desperate time in the history of North Dakota. And Anne Marie Lowe's book, Dust Bowl Diary, is a really extraordinary document about that era. Not dark at all, but certainly clouded by the Dust Bowl and all that it represented as an economic and environmental, a man-made environmental catastrophe. So I do recommend The Worst Hard Time because Timothy Egan is able to explain all this, and the key takeaway is what I just said, that the Dust Bowl was a human-generated colossal environmental catastrophe, that it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't plowed up the American West, if we had been operating as a grazing people, or if we'd been operating by no-till or proper shelter belting. There would not have been that catastrophe that occurred between 1925 and 1940, which was ruinous. I mean, there were actual dust storms, David, in Washington, D.C., while the Senate and the House sat in a debate about the Dust Bowl. A Dust Bowl cloud from Iowa and the Dakotas passed over the city of Washington in the District of Columbia, and one of the dust storms traveled 200 miles out into the Atlantic, with dust from the Great Plains. So I love Timothy Egan. I highly recommend that book and all of his books, frankly.
Elizabeth is from Trinidad, Colorado, or at least that's the station that she listens on. And her question is from the book: the United States government at one point thinks of starting a program to give back the, quote, Dust Bowl land to the first people, Native Americans, uh, because, quote, they know how to live with the land. Growing up in Nebraska, South Dakota, and living in North Dakota and Kansas, I've always known about First People and how they moved from summer camp to winter camp. Can't think of a way to ask this. The U.S. government looked at giving back the land that was taken from the First People and then thinking of returning barren land back. Wow.
It didn't happen. It didn't get very much traction. And this is something that another one of my favorite authors, Daniel Flores, talks about in his book called The Natural West, that the Great Plains, in the long view, in the long chronology of human existence, are advanced on and retreated from, that there are prolonged droughts. We may be in a short one now, but there are these prolonged droughts that last 30, 40, 150 years sometimes. And then people have to withdraw. And that this sort of yo-yo effect, or this advance and retreat, is one of the patterns of the history of the Great Plains. And so in eastern Montana now, there's white withdrawal. There's withdrawal of the ranch community from eastern Colorado lands. That's created a vacuum which is being filled by the American Prairie Reserve, which I deeply admire. The attempt to build a Buffalo Commons in these lands that are sort of emptying out. Controversial, but still magnificent. And the same has been true here. And so the Great Plains proper, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, parts of Texas, parts of New Mexico, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming. The Great Plains have had these moments when Anglo-white people have just not been able to make it work. And so there have been mass exoduses. And then the question is, what do you do with that land? Well, today, there's no land that's being abandoned. This has been a time of enormous industrial prosperity on the Great Plains, but at that time things were so desperate that they thought, well, maybe the Comanche should have some of it back, maybe the Apache, maybe the Cheyenne, maybe the Arapaho, maybe the Lakota, but it didn't get very far, and it never does.
Okay, sir, so many questions in so little time. I'm going to move on to Laura Presti. She's from Michigan, and she's looking into planning a road trip from their home through the original 13 colonies. She's interested in any ideas or tips that are must-sees, especially with children that are 5 and 7 in tow. Thank you for your time.
Wow, that's a huge. I responded to her question by email and just said that's such a huge request. There's so much to see. So I said one way to do it would be to read a biography of George Washington, because remember, David, one year while he was president, he went south. He made kind of a grand progress into the southern parts of America, some of which he had never seen. And everywhere he went, he gave speeches, and there were parades, and there were horse escorts, and he dined out with all these people who were thrilled to see the great George Washington. And then the following year, he went north and traveled up into New England. But he wanted to see the country because he wanted, as president, to know the country better. But he also wanted to be seen. He thought that presidents needed to be seen. And so he made this trip. So you could follow along a little bit in that. Obviously, you want to go to Mount Vernon, and you want to go to Philadelphia, and you want to go to Boston, and you want to go to Monticello, and you want to go to Madison's home and Monroe's and so on. And so there is a whole kind of slam dunk world that you need to see. And Washington, D.C. is a great place to take children. So those things I think are wonderful. And I would suggest also going to Williamsburg. Williamsburg is still the most extraordinary reenactment center for the early national period in the country. It's so charming. I find it most interesting to watch brooms being made and guns being manufactured, and the sort of the small industry, the cottage industries, bookbinding, those things, and they're available most weeks at Williamsburg, and they really give you a sense of, how was a candle made? How was a gun barrel rifled in this era? These things are really fascinating, and Williamsburg does a magnificent job with this. So I would suggest that they get the full ticket for a few days, and stay in, if possible, in a historic hotel there. But you can't go wrong on this trip. If that's a great theme trip. That this is the original 13 states. You have to start in New Hampshire. Vermont was not among them, and you work your way to New York and on down all the way to Georgia. And if you go to Saint Simeon, the island off the Georgia coast, that's where Aaron Burr went after he killed Hamilton. He went there. I've been there. It's a fantastic place. And he went there and stayed at a friend's plantation for a period of time while he was.
That might be a bit grim for a 5 and 7-year-old.
But no, yeah, this island, this is not a grim island. This is like Vail plus Aspen plus Telluride plus Jackson Hole. It's one of the most beautiful enclaves in America. Not inexpensive, but absolutely fabulous. And I think every child should know about the Burr conspiracy. Come on.
I will say that, I think I was about 3.5 years old when my family lived in Silver Springs, Maryland. My father worked for a congressman, and they took us on weekend jaunts, to historical places, Civil War battlefields. Oh, there's so much out there. And I have very distinct memories, even at that young age, of those trips.
They're very important trips for a young person. We had one family vacation in my entire life. It turned out to be an absolute disaster. We went to the Black Hills. It was one of those, like, it made Chevy Chase look like a smooth operator. But that was it for us. We never went east. The first time I went east was when I went off in my freshman year to Vanderbilt University on a sports writing scholarship, and my family insisted on driving me in our Chrysler New Yorker filled to the gills with, stereo equipment and other crap that we used to take to college. And we went to Hannibal, Missouri to see Mark Twain's home, his birth home, and we went to Opryland and, all the things that one can do in greater Nashville. And it was another trip from hell, but I remember it. That's the great thing about trips from hell.
We're about out of time this week, and no essay this week. A couple of weeks ago, you did an essay, and people were glad to hear it back. It really reminded me of a letter that we got from Jacob Eucharis, and he was the one who was encouraging you to bring the Jefferson Watch back. Actually, he's got his own podcast called The History of Film, so we'll have to check that out, Jacob.
What's his name?
Jacob Eucharis.
Send me that email because I want to talk to him about cinema, but also, thanks. I do want to write more essays.
And with that, sir, we need to close this week's conversation. I do want to take just one moment to thank a gentleman who stuck up for me several weeks ago, and I didn't have his name, and that was Bill Seifert. Thanks for looking out for me, Bill.
And that's the only reason that you continue to be the semi-permanent guest host. You were on probation there after that nasty letter, but
Thin ice, I'm on.
He came to your defense, and we all here at the Jefferson Hour said amen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, let's draw a close to this pleasant week of conversation on books and questions.
We will see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.